And this is the part where I check for last minute registration. Five more. Here we go. Confirming that the live stream is up and running and the recording is up and running. We're up to 20 plus attendees. So Michael, you can start whenever you like.
Okay, thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. My name is Michael Sawkiw, and I am the Executive Vice President of the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America and the Director of its Washington, D.C. Public Affairs Bureau called the Ukrainian National Information Service. It truly is an honor to moderate this UCCA webinar commemorating the first anniversary of Russia's brutal and unprovoked war in Ukraine that really has brought untold sorrow as well as killed thousands of civilians and military personnel and has forever changed the world because of the Kremlin's actions. The topic of today's discussion is called Spotlight Ukraine Views from Washington, D.C., at which we will explore the political, the economic, the humanitarian, and security context of the past 362 days of Russia's full-scale war and invasion against Ukraine. The UCCA this evening has assembled a panel of distinguished officials, both current and former, who will provide their perspective and analysis of the geostrategic importance of Ukraine and its fight for sovereignty, for territorial integrity, and freedom. But given the context of current dramatic events in Ukraine and other developments with our allies on the European continent in particular, and obviously the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine 1 year ago, President Biden's historic trip to Ukraine yesterday, and the powerful address today in Warsaw, Poland, the upcoming NATO summit in July in Vilnius, Lithuania, and thinking ahead to next year's summit in the United States commemorating the 75th anniversary of the Security Alliance, the buildup of Russian militarization of the Crimean Peninsula and the Black Sea region beginning in 2014, and the extent of expanding economic opportunities versus Russian manipulation, and I would even say intimidation. Thus, we will hear from our distinguished panel and seek their counsel, their advice, their policy recommendations for U.S. national security interests for a free and prosperous Ukraine that advances our common interests and the collective security of our allies in Europe and abroad. We will now hear remarks from our distinguished guests, but before I give them the screen, I'd like to introduce Mr. Andriy Futey, the President of the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, for a few opening remarks. Andrew, please.
Дякую, Mikhailo. Thank you, Michael. I'm grateful to our participants. I'm very grateful to these distinguished guests that we have today participating in this. But I want to be very brief and just want to mention two primary issues for our community. First and foremost is to stress upon them that as we approach this 1 year anniversary, that we as a community, not only here in the United States, but also throughout the entire diaspora, through the Ukrainian World Congress and others, need to be united. We need to continue to communicate. We need to continue to coordinate. We need to continue to speak in one voice. We need to continue to work closely with Ambassador Markarova, to work closely with the Ukrainian government in terms of the particular message. We all know that the one prime issue that the Russian government and the Russian misinformation has is to try to divide us. And we've been very successful as an active, very fruitful community to work together, no matter what organization, to work together with the ambassador, to work in terms of our message to the United States Congress. So my plea continues to be to the Ukrainian American community. Let's continue working together. Let's coordinate. Let's make sure that we stay on message, and that when we speak to the administration and we speak to the US Congress, we speak in one voice. Secondly, and most importantly, and you just mentioned this, the historic visit by President Biden to Kyiv, his message today in Warsaw, unites us all, be it Republican, be it Democrat, be it no matter what party. And I want to applaud on behalf of the entire Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, our member organizations, our branches, our community, 2 million strong Ukrainian American community throughout the United States. We applaud the bipartisan Congress for their continued strong support of Ukraine. We'll continue to hear from us. We will continue banging the doors and knocking on your doors throughout the weeks to come. But without your support, we would not be today where we are. And I encourage our Ukrainian American community to keep working closely with their elected office holders, with their public officials in Washington, the administration, and everyone else. So Slava Ukraini, I look forward to hearing from a distinguished panel. Working together, we will win this war. Do peremоги, to victory. Slava Ukraini.
Heroyam Slava. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you. Prior to introducing our speakers, I want to mention something to our audience participants as well, that please note that all the questions for our speakers must be submitted in the Q&A function in the toolbar below. And now to continue with opening remarks, it is an honor and truly a distinct pleasure to welcome to our webinar a person who really needs no introduction, for she is seen nationwide and I would even say worldwide in her unrelenting advocacy for her country's interests. May I introduce Her Excellency Oksana Markarova, Ukraine's ambassador to the United States. Madam Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Good evening. It's actually my honor and pleasure to be with such a distinguished group of people, friends, I should say, this evening and talk about something that is very important to all of us, the fight for freedom, the fight for democracy. So Michael and Andriy, thank you for all your tireless work, for everything Ukrainian Congress Committee of America has done, and for putting together this webinar, especially as we approach a very sad one-year mark after 8 years of war, another 1 year, but now on full-fledged war everywhere in Ukraine. It's really a pleasure also to see here two remarkable friends of Ukraine, two senators who have been with us before February 24th, who has clearly shown that values of freedom and values of democracy is something that not only this great country is built on, but also something that you constantly fight for and work for. And you have shown, both Senator Blumenthal and Senator Portman, that not only you are exemplary servants of your country, but you are, if I may call you Ukrainians, because as we say, there are Ukrainians by birth and by blood, but we also now invented a new category of Ukrainians by choice. And we are so happy that we have so many Ukrainians by choice in this great country. I know you have visited both Ukraine even after the full-fledged war started, and you've done it so before. And actually, Senator Portman, we've met in Ukraine a long time ago. So thank you for every draft law, for every resolution, for every speech. We miss you, Senator Portman, in Congress now, but we work with you very actively in your new rules. And Senator Blumenthal, we need your leadership because the war is not over yet. Now, 200 and almost a full year have been really difficult. We have seen all types of war crimes in Ukraine. We have seen tragedies of unimaginable proportions. We have seen brutality that we would not expect even from the enemies like Russians. And we knew what they're capable of because for more than almost 400 years, our country has been occupied by either Russian Federation, Russian Empire, whatever they called themselves, including the Soviet Union. But today is the day when we will not talk about the atrocities or about the war crimes or about everything they're doing. I mean, we talk about that every time. But we also will talk about the resilience and that regardless of all these difficulties, we already have shown that Russia cannot win in 3 days, in 1 week, And on the 24th of February, we will clearly show that Russia cannot win in a year. And now it's time to move from saying that we will not give up, we will not surrender, to that we will win, we must win, and we must also decisively defeat Russia for what they have done. So truly remarkable visit of President Biden. We are so honored that on the President's Day, we have seen two great presidents together in Kyiv, regardless of the sirens during the war. And it was yet another symbol of unwavering support from the people of this great country, from Americans, which is the most important thing, because American people support Ukrainian people in this fight, because American people understand that it's so much bigger than just the fight for Ukrainian freedom, democracy, homes, loved ones, that it's so important for all of us to win this fight, that we have this support, that we need to have the support to have 2023 victorious year. What does victory mean for us? And I will close by saying that we put it together in President Zelensky's peace formula, that to win is to restore territorial integrity as it in the recognized, internationally recognized borders, the territory for which in 1991, 98% of Ukrainians voted to be independent everywhere, including Crimea, including Donetsk, including Lugansk. It means to return everyone, every Ukrainian who is being illegally held by Russia anywhere, especially our children, but it's also to deliver justice, regardless of how much time it will take, and hold everyone accountable, including Mr. Putin, for the crime of aggression, including everyone who did the crimes on the ground in Ukraine or elsewhere. And I will just close that we would not be able to do it without the help of the United States. And I know that we will win together, and Ukrainian people will always remember that the role that American people played in securing and defending our freedom and democracy. So I look forward to the discussion, and I look forward also to seeing everyone on the 25th of February near the Lincoln Memorial at the big rally that we're holding at this 1 year mark. God bless America, and Slava Ukraini.
Madam Ambassador, thank you. Thank you for your remarks. Thank you for your energy, for your passion, which you bring in representing the country of Ukraine here in the United States. I know, Madam Ambassador, that you must depart because you have to attend to other matters of interest. So we thank you once again for joining us in this webinar to mark the first anniversary of the brutal invasion of Russia of Ukraine. But let's also look in terms of, as you had said, let's look in the positive. Let's look for a better and brighter future for Ukraine, a victory for Ukraine. We thank you, Madam Ambassador. We wish you much fortitude, much strength, and continued success in all your efforts to ensure a true Ukrainian victory in this war. Thank you. Дякую. We will now commence with our two astounding friends of Ukraine who are also with us, two great senators from the states of Connecticut and Ohio, respectively, the Honorable Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut and Rob Portman of Ohio. I don't think that either of the distinguished guests needs truly any type of an introduction. However, briefly, I'll mention that both senators have been stalwart supporters of Ukraine for years, I would even say decades. They have traveled extensively to Ukraine, as the ambassador had mentioned in her remarks. They've traveled together, and most recently, in the past 12 months, 1 year of the war, they have traveled to Ukraine during wartime and have met with President Zelensky and other government officials. Senator Blumenthal is a senior senator from Connecticut and sits on the very powerful Senate Armed Services Committee, the Judiciary Committee, and the Committee on Veterans Affairs. While Senator Portman, who is now retired from the United States Senate, was the co-chair of the Senate Ukraine Caucus and sat on the prominent committees such as the Senate Foreign Relations. To open up this discussion, Senator Blumenthal, let's begin with you and any opening remarks you might wish to share about the context of the past 1 year of war in Ukraine, the future of the global support for Ukraine to win this war, and your perspective. I know that you just returned from the Munich Security Conference and from other opportunities in Europe. Please, Senator, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Michael, and thank you for bringing us together. First, let me just thank the ambassador for her courage, her conscience, her credibility. She has become one of the main voices and faces in the United States Congress, and everyone there, and I mean to a person, regards her with such respect and admiration. And so my thanks, Madam Ambassador, and especially thanks for what I regard as one of the highest compliments ever, to be regarded as a Ukrainian. You could not say anything more generous or kinder. From what I have seen about the Ukrainian people, as have Americans over this past year, their courage, perseverance, fortitude are in the highest traditions of the American fight for freedom, independence, and democracy. And I want to thank Michael and Andriy for your leadership, and to the Ukrainian American community. You know, I've spent a lot of time with folks in Connecticut, folks from all around the country, and their passion for Ukraine, I think, has inspired so many in the United States. And it has been, I will emphasize, a bipartisan cause. Senator Portman and I have worked together. We traveled to Kyiv together. We've spoken on the floor of the Senate together. We've cajoled our colleagues together. In fact, one of his last speeches I will never recall from Senator Portman on the floor was about the need for providing Ukraine F-16s, planes that both of us think are absolutely necessary. And I have repeated and pummeled the administration on this point as recently as today. But I also really want to begin by citing the administration's recent visit, the president's visit, and his speech today. And let me just quote, when Russia invaded, it wasn't just Ukraine being tested. The whole world faced a test for the ages. Mm-hmm. And the questions we face are as simple as they are profound. Would we respond, or would we look the other way? 1 year later, we know the answer. We did respond. We would be strong. We would be united, and the world would not look the other way. And I agree completely with the ambassador. We are not just defending. We are not just stopping the Russians at the current boundaries. We must push them out of Ukraine. We must win. We must break through, and we must provide the Ukrainian forces with whatever is necessary to return to the borders that existed and territorial integrity that can be entrusted in at the time when Ukraine agreed to give up its nuclear weapons on the condition that its borders be guaranteed and respected. And so I think now we have faced a pivotal moment. I've been to Ukraine 3 times over roughly the last year. First, before the invasion, when I came back and I said, literally, to President Biden, you know, I think we're underestimating the Ukrainians. They're going to fight. President Zelensky is not going to lead. And as he said to me at one point during one of my visits, Ukrainians will fight with pitchforks if necessary. Well, their fight is our fight. They should not have to fight with pitchforks. They are defending democracies and freedom around the world. And we should not be providing American troops on the ground. President Zelensky hasn't asked for them. But we should give the Ukrainians everything we would provide if there were American troops on the ground. We provided the javelins and Stingers, but with some delay. We provided the HIMAR long-range artillery, but with some delay. We provided the Patriot air defense, but with some delay. We provided the tanks, Leopards and Challengers, and the Abrams tanks, but with delay. We cannot delay providing the planes, but most especially the training that is needed for those pilots. At the Munich conference over this past weekend, I found near unanimity on that point. The Brits are already training pilots. We should be doing the same. And the numbers of longer range artillery, drones, whatever is necessary, we should be providing, and stiffening sanctions. The vice president and the president are both right. The Russians have committed crimes against humanity. Crimes against humanity. I agree. We should declare that Russia is a state sponsor of terrorism, which would enable tightening of those sanctions beyond where they are right now in a very meaningful, much more impactful way. We should provide the humanitarian assistance that's necessary. I went to Ukraine twice during the invasion, taking that overnight train from the Polish border to Kyiv. In fact, I thought about the president on that train. The reports are that he couldn't sleep, and I couldn't sleep either. I was so excited to be visiting. And on my way back, I was so inspired and moved by the words from President Zelensky and from many of his ministers, their can-do attitude, repairing the infrastructure, working miracles with the transformers, repairing them, literally repairing the plane, so to speak, while it was still flying. And I will just close with one of my most recent experiences. After the Munich conference, I went to the US Army garrison in Bavaria, Gotford Wall, and watched Ukrainian fighters being trained on Bradley tanks, combined fire on the fields, these long, vast grassy fields under chilling gray skies, much like Ukraine's, talking to them. These young men, a year ago, one was a baker, another a computer programmer, a warehouse guard. They enlisted, they are part of this fight. And one of the senior officers said to me on the side, you know, I'm not an emotional guy, but sometimes I have to look away because I know these young men and women, many of them will not be returning. Very few of them will be unhurt. Their courage and their determination inspired me beyond words. The same feelings I had when I returned from Kyiv, having met some of the veterans who'd been wounded, having met some of the parents who'd lost loved ones. Ukrainians are shedding their blood to preserve our democracy because we know Putin is a thug. He is an aggressor. He will keep moving against NATO nations if he is not stopped. He's a bully. And the only way to stop bullies is to stop them. His only respect is for military force. And we will need to hold him accountable, as the ambassador said so eloquently. We need to make sure that these war criminals are brought to justice and held accountable. That is why Senator Graham and Senator Whitehouse and I have worked on providing resources to the prosecutor. We've met with him 5 times, the Ukrainian prosecutor, most recently over last weekend. He's doing a very diligent job of assembling the evidence, but he needs more help with forensics and with the resources that are needed to channel and combine the evidence. And we must insist on accountability because this is the crime of this century. This is the crime of this century. This is the fight of our lives. And we are on the right side of history, the right side for democracy. And I am just so proud and moved always to be a Ukrainian supporter and in heart and spirit, a Ukrainian. Thank you so much. Slava Ukraine.
Senator, your incredible overview and perspective of the past 12 months and even before it was just so eloquently said. I took so many notes and I have a lot of questions as follow-up, but I thank you for everything that you're doing within the halls of the Senate. Thank you for the sponsorship of all your bills, whether it was in the previous Congress, the 117th Congress, already 2 months into the 118th Congress, and your name is already prominently featured on many bills Ukraine related to help Ukraine. So from, again, the Ukrainian American community, thank you. Thank you for this partnership. Thank you for this cooperation. And obviously, we're all in this fight together, as you had mentioned.
Thank you.
Senator Portman, I'll ask the same question to you in terms of your perspective, your insight of the war in Ukraine. What are the challenges that you see the global community of democracy faces when trying to defeat Russia and to ensure that Ukraine is victorious in this battle?
Michael, thank you for your leadership and for the good work you've been doing in Washington. I've always enjoyed working with you long before this second invasion and the war. And to Andy Futey, my friend from Ohio, who I've known for decades and who joined me on the border with Ukraine, has joined me in Ukraine a number of times. And to the ambassador, Ambassador Markarova and I have become close friends because there's so much to be done to educate colleagues and friends of Ukraine have rallied around her and rallied around the country, but there's a broader group of Americans who need to be brought in, and she's done an exceptional job of representing the country. So I'm delighted to be joining you all this evening. Senator Blumenthal and I have traveled to Ukraine. We've also traveled to the border together. In fact, in March, right after the latest invasion a year ago, we went to the border and with Poland and welcomed refugees coming in, spoke with them. And it was a very emotional experience, as you can imagine, almost all women, many grandmothers with their kids, lots of tears, lots of anger, of course, directed at Putin and recognition of his illegal and brutal and totally unprovoked attack on Ukraine, a country that just wants to live in peace with its neighbors, including Russia, but also anger with the United States that we at that time were not providing the air cover that, as you may recall, the Ukrainians had been asking for as soon as the February attacks occurred. And it was a difficult experience to say we're doing what we can. And at that point, I realized that we had to do more. The tears were streaming down the cheeks of these women saying, I've left my husband behind. I've left my son behind. I've had my apartment destroyed. I need more help. And so I've been back 3 times during this latest period and also at the Moldovan border. And my focus tonight will actually not be so much on what has happened. And I've given 30 floor speeches, as you know, on the Senate floor about that, but more about, where do we go from here? And because many of the people on the call tonight are people who are strongly supporting Ukraine, I want to challenge you and challenge us to do a better job of explaining the consequences of a Ukrainian defeat, the consequences of a Russian victory. I think that we have now in this country, to be frank, some receding support for providing taxpayer funding for the humanitarian effort, for the economic effort in Ukraine, and for the military effort. And we have to acknowledge that. And by doing so, we will also challenge ourselves to come up with a better message in terms of why this is so important. We all feel it in our hearts. We understand it. But unfortunately, many Americans are beginning to experience war fatigue and taxpayer fatigue. So I would make a couple of suggestions tonight. One would be that we need to do a better job explaining what the alternative would be and would have been had the United States not taken this leadership role. And by the way, like it or not, the United States is exclusively able to provide the leadership that's needed to push back against this Russian invasion. We are the indispensable country. Not that all the other 40 or 50 countries who have provided military assistance aren't also indispensable, but without American leadership, I don't believe that Ukraine today would be an independent country. So we have to acknowledge that and take on some responsibility there. President Kennedy once famously wrote in a speech that he never gave because he was to deliver it the afternoon of the day he was assassinated. But the speech said something like this: by destiny rather than choice, America are the watchguards on the walls of world freedom. By destiny rather than choice. By destiny rather than choice, it's America that must stand up and gather the free world together to fight for this freedom and independence and democracy and territorial integrity that is core to who we are and have been as a country and to our founding. So my suggestion would be to think about the alternative. What if we had not stepped forward? What if we didn't step forward tomorrow? What if we were not providing this assistance? What would happen? Well, there would be tremendous war crimes and other atrocities being committed all throughout the country of Ukraine, of course. It would be a horrific situation. But from a very practical point of view, you would also have 4 additional countries that are NATO allies that we have a mutual defense agreement with under Article 5 that would suddenly find themselves on the border with Russia. And those countries, Poland included, would be asking, understandably, for our help. We would be massing troops, we would be massing equipment, we would have to be doing much more, in my view, in terms of American support than we are doing currently. In a way, Ukraine is fighting this fight for us. And I think sometimes we forget that. And sometimes it's easy to think, well, if we walked away, there wouldn't be consequences for us. There would be enormous consequences, including for our taxpayers. So I hope that argument is one that we begin to explain and expand on and let people know that, sadly, we live in a dangerous and volatile world. And Vladimir Putin made a choice here to invade illegally, brutally, totally unprovoked. Second, what would the consequence be for the rest of the world? Other countries would be looking at Ukraine and thinking they couldn't stand on their own, and the democracies who said they supported them wouldn't stand at their side.
Hmm.
We need to arm. We need nuclear weapons. We need more conventional weapons. We need to do things that we assumed were not necessary because NATO and the free world would stand up for us and with us, and the territorial integrity mattered. What would happen in Europe? You would have enormous instability. For the first time since World War II, almost 80 years, you would have a situation where you had a ground war approaching the continent. Vladimir Putin has been very clear that this is not just about Ukraine. He wants to recreate, sometimes he says the Russian Federation, sometimes the former Soviet Union. That does not include just Ukraine. It includes all those frontier countries along what would then be the border of Russia and others. So I think we need to be very frank about the fact that there is no free lunch here. America has to stand up and be heard as always. Finally, I would say that there are global implications that go well beyond Ukraine. We've talked a lot about China and Taiwan in the United States Congress and the importance of ensuring that China doesn't take the wrong message from this. Well, they'll take the wrong message if Vladimir Putin is allowed to complete this horrific mission. But also think about the consequences in terms of our ability to push back against China. If we are to pull back here, China will get the message that we are pulling back in terms of our fight for freedom and democracy and territorial integrity. Other countries also will be looking at this. Iran, North Korea. Iran has designs, as you know, on other countries in the Middle East. Why would those authoritarian countries think anything other than, well, it's easier now. America is pulling back. The free world is pulling back. So I think we have to talk about not just the incredible importance of us protecting freedom and democracy, but also about what would the consequences be if we were not so engaged. And finally, I must say, I think we need to talk about accountability more. The new Speaker of the House has said that there is no blank check here. I don't disagree with him on that. It's not a blank check. I've been to Ukraine over a dozen times. As the ambassador said, I met with her back when she was finance minister before this latest invasion. Every time I go, I've worked on transparency and reforms to the judicial system and ensuring that the Ukrainian people continue to fight corruption and move the country in the right direction. And they were entirely on board in doing that and continue to do it unbelievably even during this time of war. But it is very important for us as Americans to be able to tell our taxpayers that yes, there are measures in place to ensure this money is being properly spent. And I will tell you, we don't talk enough about that. The accounting firm Deloitte is in Ukraine, having been hired to do exactly that, to audit how the money is being spent, to provide reports to the donors, including us, the United States. And Deloitte being there is something that the Ukrainian government insisted on. If you talk to President Zelensky about this topic of accountability, he is adamant that the Ukrainian government continue to provide absolute confidence to the United States and the world that this money is being properly spent. And Deloitte is part of it. Another part of it is the fact that our funding, as you know, that goes for state aid, goes through the World Bank. Why? The World Bank provides monitoring as well. They issue us reports. They do audits to ensure that the money is properly spent, that is non-military. And then on the military side, there's something going on that we don't talk about enough, which is extraordinary and actually unprecedented, which is end-use monitoring, where we're actually monitoring by serial number what weapons are going into Ukraine and where they're ending up and what their use is and what happens to them. As best we can tell, there is not a single weapon system that has gotten into the wrong hands. That's extraordinary.
Mhm.
And I imagine what happened at some point. But it's amazing to me that although the Ukrainians have taken so much Russian equipment, and by the way, that which is not destroyed, reused it. In some cases, they've actually repaired Russian tanks and then used them against the Russians. But that the converse has not happened with American equipment or arms. So this end-use monitoring is part of the accountability measures. I've been with the 101st Airborne and with the 82nd Airborne, each of which had responsibilities and continue with regard to the 101st in terms of taking equipment from all over the world and sending it into Ukraine and monitoring it. And I think they're doing an enormous service to us and to our taxpayers by doing this end-use monitoring. And God bless them. Many of you have visited them in their base in Poland near the border. And you know what I'm talking about. So I think we need to face the fact that Russia continues a war that made no sense from the beginning, and that the only way to turn the tide, to win the war, is to win on the battlefield and to continue to tighten on the sanctions. For a while, I think many have thought, well, since Russia was unsuccessful in its initial invasion and wanted to take Kyiv and couldn't, and I've been to that airfield where those brave National Guardsmen fought off the special operators and Chechens from the Russian forces. You might have thought that the Russians might pull back, but that's not what they're doing. The only way we get them to the bargaining table and come up with what we all view as an appropriate conclusion to this war is to win. So now is not the time to pull back. Now is the time to make these arguments we've made tonight, make them forcefully so that the American people continue to support the Ukrainian people in their fight for freedom, and that we continue to provide Ukraine the tools they need to properly defend themselves. Senator Blumenthal has been at the lead on that. I totally agree with him about F-16s and have been saying it, well, for the last year. I believe also that the Abrams tanks, I think we've committed to 41 of them. That's not enough. They're not likely to be delivered till the end of the year. That's too late. So there are certain things that we can and should do. The weapons that they need right now also include ammunition. And they need a longer range rocket to be able to attack the logistics and the command posts and the munitions depots that have pulled back away from the HIMARS. These HIMARS are very effective, but if they had a longer range, they could be much more effective at cutting off the supply lines. And I do believe that we are now experiencing an offensive by Russia. I believe President Zelensky has said that clearly, and I think he's right when you look at the facts on the ground. The counteroffensive will be effective also from the Ukrainians, but only if we provide them with the weapons they need to be able to succeed. So thank you again, Andy, Michael, my friend, Senator Blumenthal, Ambassador Markarova, thank you for your unity, your resilience. Andy made the point that the diaspora needs to stay unified. We all need to stay unified in NATO, within Ukraine. And that's exactly what we're seeing, much to the dismay of Vladimir Putin. Thank you.
Senator, I don't know how to thank you for those remarks. I've taken so many notes and and have a lot of follow-up questions as well. But what a tremendous overview of not just the past year and what wasn't done, but looking forward into the future. And I'd actually like to pick up on something of the 3 points that you had mentioned of the narrative. What is the alternative? I think in today's speech in Warsaw, I think it was quite evident that that's what at least President Biden was trying to do, was trying to show that there is, what is the alternative if Ukraine does not win this war? I think we can all say that the war in Ukraine is transformational for world history, transformational for European history, obviously transformational for Ukrainian history, but also for the transatlantic partnership that has existed since post-World War II, and that framework of security, which we fought so hard for that freedom that existed since post-World War II. President Biden mentioned that word freedom several times throughout his speech today. And also one of the aspects of looking in the future and what is the alternative is, I think we have to understand that this is an ideological threat that Putin represents in terms of his war in Ukraine, but not just his war in Ukraine, but what that signifies and what that gives to other authoritarian regimes throughout the world, those signals potentially of what may happen in the future. Therefore, it is a threat. It is a threat to world security. And here, both senators, the ambassador, have so eloquently stated that that Russia must be defeated, that Ukraine must be victorious. I go back to President Biden's speech today in Warsaw, and I actually took down a few notes as he was speaking. And the president's speech itself was, to me, reassuring. It was hopeful in terms of what the community of democracies have to give to Ukraine, but also to the rest of the world. There was a commitment to Ukraine. There was building peace and security, building dignity, as President Biden had mentioned in his speech in Ukraine. He said that there is no more noble goal than the aspiration for freedom, and that in terms of aspiring towards that freedom, is the president eloquently stated that we will stand with you if you stand with us, meaning all democracies of the world. And he noted that obviously Kyiv stands very, very proudly. During yesterday's historic visit to Kyiv, today's speech in Warsaw, there were many on the news channels that were discussing the parameters. What are the next steps? Former CIA Director Leon Panetta had actually said that, to your points, senators, that we must put everything on the table. Both of you, senators, from the word get-go on February 24th, and even before that, had truly advocated for as much security assistance to Ukraine as possible, because we know what it means if Ukraine, God forbid, is to lose this war. But the former CIA director had said we must put everything on the table. But then he went a step further to your last point, Senator Portman, about unity. He said we must maintain unity of the United States, of NATO, and all of our European allies in showing that Ukraine can win and is winning this war. And he said that that will help to spur continued support, even more overwhelming support for Ukraine. Long-winded question coming to the both of you. What are the next steps? What do we see as absolutely critical and necessary for Ukraine to win this war? And again, we must repeat that there's a difference in terms of just quote unquote defeating Russia and making sure that Ukraine is victorious on the battlefield and getting back all of its territory from the 1991 Declaration of Independence. So open-ended question. Senator Portman, Senator Blumenthal, whomever would like to answer first.
Go ahead, Dick.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks for your eloquence as usual. I think there are a number of steps. First of all, in the next 3-5 days, we're going to have ceremonies and public events all around the country. I'm having one here in Connecticut on Thursday night, and the ambassador very kindly has provided a video to us. It will enlist the Ukrainian American community, but also students on the Yale campus from there and others from around the country to reawaken that feeling of commitment. And Senator Portman's right that there are receding poll numbers, but I don't believe they indicate a lack of support. I think it's just no longer top of mind. So we need to return it to the top of Americans' minds. Second, let me just put this in very blunt, specific terms. Training pilots, providing the F-16s. You know, I'm on the Armed Services Committee. Our military knows why F-16s are necessary to knock out the Russians' air defenses, their radar. Otherwise, they will continue to rain terror from the skies, and they will stop some of our artillery, some of the Ukrainian advance. If they knock out their air defenses, then the MiGs can come along and continue to provide air superiority. So the F-16s are essential, so are drones and other technology that we can provide. It is, again, a test. As the president said so well, it is a test of all democracies. Third, we need to maintain NATO unity. At the Munich conference over this past weekend, I spoke to the foreign ministers of our major allies, and they are rock solid. They are on board, they are gung-ho. They raise the point about accountability, as do some of my colleagues. And let me just say that as recently as about 4 weeks ago, I sat with the 101st Airborne, the logistics people who do that end-use monitoring. And they said unequivocally, no waste, no fraud in the use of the military supplies and equipment we are providing. And we met with President Zelensky, by the way. If you want someone who is a champion against corruption, look at President Zelensky. On the same day that we visited with him at around that time, he was arresting members of his own administration who were alleged to have committed crimes of corruption, not using United States money or supplies, but other kinds of corrupt acts. So he is zealously pursuing any corruption because he knows that it is necessary for us to maintain the credibility of this effort. And I would just say, finally, because there are tough times ahead, and this will continue to be a bloody war. You know, whenever as I said earlier, whenever I visited Ukraine, and even when I was with those Ukrainian warriors in Germany being trained to operate those Bradleys, combined arms tactics, the sacrifices that are being made literally for our sake should be honored and highlighted, because truly the impact on the world cannot be overestimated. China is watching. There's no question Xi is watching. Whatever he thought about our disunity, our lack of resolve, he's going to have to think about it again if he wants to invade Taiwan. We are teaching him a lesson. We are teaching other autocrats and tyrants a lesson. And we need to teach them a lesson also, that innocent women and children cannot have their hands tied behind their backs. Hundreds of them shot through the head, as we saw the evidence of at Bucha and other towns surrounding Kyiv. Those towns are reachable by car in about 15, 20 minutes. That is how close Putin came to Kyiv. That is how close democracy in Ukraine hung in the balance. And let me say again, what I've said to many of our military, I've said it to the highest levels of the White House. The most common miscalculation has been to underestimate the Ukrainian people. They are can-do, they are quick studies. Don't tell me that training is an obstacle. I saw them trained. They will do the job if we give them the tools.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Portman.
Well, I think Senator Blumenthal has summarized it very, very well. I would just add something in terms of going forward. You know, sometimes we have been guilty of saying this is a pivotal moment every couple of weeks in this war. But let me make a distinction between what has happened in the past and what's happening this week as we talk, and this night as we talk in the trenches on the front line. The Russian offense, which is being bolstered by the Wagner group, and a lot of the soldiers, as you know, in the Wagner organization are prisoners who were told that if they are willing to fight, that they will have their sentences reduced or eliminated, have an amnesty. Many Russians are dying, many Ukrainians are dying, but Russia seems to be uncaring in terms of throwing troops into harm's way, including walking troops apparently across minefields just to trigger the mines. I think we have to acknowledge that President Putin seems to be of the opinion that the patience of the West will not last as long as his troops that he can put into battle or his missiles that he can get from Iran or elsewhere. We have to prove him wrong. But at this pivotal moment, while the Russians are making some progress in a part of Eastern Ukraine, and the Wagner group is in its brutal and horrific way, grinding out a slow advance, that the West must provide the Ukrainians what they need more quickly. And President Zelensky has said it as clearly as anyone, and with more passion than anyone, which is we need to speed it up. These are the weapons we need. This is why we need them. We need to speed it up. And my concern is that if we don't, that you will see some momentum on the Russian side. I don't think this sort of grinding process they're going through with incremental gains, kilometer by kilometer, has a great strategic importance to the war. But I do think it could have an effect on morale on both sides. So you asked about going forward. I say going forward is now, and that we need to act more quickly. I mentioned the fact that American tanks are not due to arrive until the end of the year. I mentioned we still haven't provided the ability for other countries to provide F-16s. One thing that gets lost sometimes in these discussions is that the Ukrainians are willing to take F-16s from other countries, third countries, but under the license agreements that we have with those countries, of course, they can't resell our sophisticated military equipment to other countries. They'd like permission to do that. My understanding is there are a few countries ready to go. As was noted, the Brits are training some Ukrainian pilots. I've talked to Ukrainian pilots in Ukraine and in Washington when they came to visit. Michael, you saw them there.
Yep.
Some of their top guns and so-called, and they're ready to go. So same with the tanks. There are Abrams M1 tanks in theater. There are some in the region, in the Mideast, that could be provided. But again, America would have to provide the authority to do that, permission to do that. So we're getting into a level of detail here that might not be viewed as necessary, but I think it is necessary for us to talk specifically about what's needed. These longer range missiles we talked about earlier are needed in order to have the kind of victories we saw in the Kharkiv region, the Kherson region, where there was a breakthrough. Why? Because the Russians could not be resupplied easily, because the HIMARS and other HIMAR-like weapon systems that the Germans and the Brits and others had been sending were actually working. So now we need longer range missiles to continue to have them work because the Russians have pulled back. So the military planners know all this. And my sense is that at this pivotal moment, if we do speed up our deliveries and provide these resources, there could be an early spring offensive by the Ukrainians and another breakthrough. But the alternative is also possible, which is that the Russians will continue to make grinding progress, which would shift the momentum and create potential problems for Ukraine and for the free world. So to answer your question, going forward, let's double down right now. I've talked about the need for a surge. I know a surge is not always popular to hear because some have been unsuccessful and some have been actually quite successful. But our surge ought to be now, not just with the United States, but with all of the countries in the region. Those Leopard 2 tanks from Germany need to actually be delivered and put into service. Those additional air defense systems that have been promised by other European countries need to be put into service now. There's no time to waste. So Ukrainians have been, as we said earlier, resilient. They've also been brilliant in learning quickly how to operate equipment, learning quickly how to help with regard to the software that's being deployed in the region from some great American companies. Microsoft has provided help with regard to the cloud. Obviously, there has been help with regard to satellite communications thanks to Starlink. And there has also been Palantir and other kinds of companies have provided incredible software to help the Ukrainians to become more successful, which is one reason, in addition to training, that they've been able to be so successful with a much smaller force. That must be redoubled right now too. And I would not underestimate the ability of Ukrainians to learn how to use these tools very quickly. That's what they've shown time and time again. That should not be an excuse. So that would be my plea tonight, Michael, is that all of us double down on the messaging, being sure the American people understand the importance of this conflict to the United States national security. And then second, that we redouble our efforts to push our leaders and others to be able to provide more and better weapons more quickly at this crucial moment.
Senator, there are a few questions, and unfortunately we can't get to all of them because we're really kind of pressed for time here. One question in terms of lethal assistance is not so much in terms of the assistance that the West can give to Ukraine, but obviously we know that the Chinese foreign minister was in Moscow today as well, meeting with his counterpart, and the potential of lethal assistance given to Russia so that obviously it has its quote unquote surge in Ukraine for a counteroffensive, or offensive. That's one aspect, but I think a very important part that we've alluded to in terms of messaging is also the disinformation that's coming out of the Kremlin, out of Moscow as well. How do we combat that Russian disinformation? Because it's not just here in the United States. It's not just within the political polling that we see here, but it's worldwide. We interact with various communities, in particular with some of the Hispanic communities, the Latin communities of Central and South America, where they say that RT, Russia Today, in those particular countries is predominantly all anti-Ukrainian. How do we help to combat some of that disinformation so that on a world scale, everybody is supporting Ukraine and not necessarily behind the eight ball when it comes to that disinformation?
Michael, great question. And, in the United States, we tend to rely on the basic goodness and the truth of our message, that it will be self-evident to people that we're saying the right thing, that we're speaking the truth. But you're absolutely right. It has to be communicated relentlessly. It has to be repeated in ways that are accessible to people, not in the kind of highfalutin terms that we might hear on the Senate floor, but in terms of how it really matters to people. Mm-hmm. And let me make 2 points in that regard. Number one of the reasons for holding back at some point was the fear about Putin escalating to use nuclear weapons. We haven't mentioned it. I think that point is highly revealing. And the reason is that it has receded as a danger. And the reason it has receded as a danger is because Putin knows that if he uses a tactical nuclear weapon, it is likely to be regarded as an act of war against NATO, and he will have to contend with all of NATO, just as if he had attacked a NATO ally under Article 5. And we need to make clear to him that is our position, so that he will not be tempted to resort to tactical nuclear weapons. And significantly, in the speech that he just delivered, that 2-hour diatribe, which was a lot of bunk and bluster for domestic consumption home, he did not mention tactical nuclear weapons. He withdrew participation in the START treaty, but he didn't mention tactical nuclear weapon. Second point, there's going to be pressure to negotiate. We should resist it unless and until President Zelensky thinks that negotiations are in the interest of Ukraine. Because the great danger here is that people want peace. That's not itself a danger, but that they will come to the negotiating table, which is what Putin wants, so he can have an interregnum, a kind of ceasefire where he can build his forces and then come at Ukraine with all the ferocity and fury that he sought to do initially when he was pushed back. He's learned a couple of lessons about the inferiority of his military and their weaknesses. But we must work to a point where the territorial integrity of Ukraine is assured by international agreement, so that Putin has no opportunity to use whatever the results of negotiation to just repeat his absolutely intolerable aggression. And finally, it's been said a couple of times, but I can't emphasize enough. I'm a prosecutor by training and career. For 20 years, I was the state's attorney general. I was the chief federal prosecutor, the U.S. attorney in Connecticut for 4.5 years. And I say, when somebody breaks the law, when someone commits an atrocity, a repugnant war crime, they need to be held accountable. We should not lose sight of the moral force of what we're doing here. This war must be won, but we must also win the peace. And Nuremberg was very, very important to World War II. It sent a message about what we would do with war criminals and crimes against humanity. And we can't just stop with some kind of negotiation. Ukraine must win, and then there can be negotiations.
Senator, I'm going to paraphrase a remark that actually I had read last week in a particular opinion piece where the basis was saying that a fake peace is nothing more than a recipe for a future war. So
we know about fake peaces because Chamberlain came back.
That's right.
Peace in our time, right?
Exactly.
And Rob Portman is so right. Speed, time, and to talk about that era or a later one, Winston Churchill once said, America does the right thing, but sometimes it tries everything else first. And we don't have the luxury of trying everything else. We must do the right thing. We must do it right now.
Let's hope we learn from history. Yes. Senator Portman.
Well, let me just finish with a comment about the response to the disinformation. There is an organization at the State Department called the Global Engagement Center that's trying hard to get the right words out.
That was your initiative, Senator. Thank you.
Yeah,
yes,
and it's
thank you.
It's underfunded, frankly. Other countries, you mentioned RT as an example. Russians spend hundreds of millions of dollars in all of our cities or towns, wherever you live, spreading their disinformation. And so we're at a disadvantage in the sense that, our government's not as aggressive at dealing with disinformation as they are in promoting it. But ultimately, people are pretty smart. And just providing the facts relentlessly is absolutely crucial. The reason that the ICC is important here, which is the International Criminal Court, we talked about the Prosecutor General in Ukraine, with whom Dick and I have met, and he's very important as well. But to have the ICC proceed on the global stage with war crimes, and they've been collecting forensic information relentlessly over the past several months, and I know that from talking to the prosecutor himself, to have them actually begin this process now, I think is very important to push back against the disinformation, because it will reveal for all to see the horrific war crimes that have been committed time and time again. Tonight in trenches around Bakhmut, Ukrainian soldiers are facing another onslaught. The artillery is being fired at them, waves and waves of Russian soldiers, some of whom are, poorly trained, but they're still deadly. About 5 years ago, I went to Bakhmut, and it was at my request to be able to go to what was called the line of contact, which is where the first invasion battle lines were drawn. And, we had flak vests on and helmets, and we had to duck because of the snipers, the Russian snipers who were taking pot shots and killing the Ukrainians. It wasn't like now, the deaths were less, but still, people forget there were over 3,000 Ukrainians dying every year at this line of contact. And while I was there, I met with the Ukrainian soldiers who were fighting. And that's when I decided that these guys were going to fight till the bitter end, until the end, that they were going to be not just resilient and resolved, but extremely effective fighting force. And with the training from the United States and Canada and the EU, they became an even more effective force. But they gave me a flag, and the flag said, "Glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes." Mm-hmm. And then written in it, "Slava Ukraini, Heroyam Slava." And I took the flag home. I framed it and put it in my office. And I had no idea that resounding call of patriotism and unity, Slava Ukraini, would become so important. But I look back on that now, and I think about those soldiers I met, and I think that from what I've been told, because it was in Bakhmut, this very town that has now been totally destroyed by Russian artillery. The photographs from there make it look like a scene out of World War I. If you've seen All Quiet on the Western Front, that's what it looked like. Today, that's what it looks like. Yeah. And that most of those soldiers probably had not survived, but that their spirit, their heart was strong. Slava Ukraini, Heroyam Slava. Glory to Ukraine, all glory to Ukraine, but also glory to the heroes. They are the heroes. They are standing on the front lines for all of us. And tonight, as they do that and we talk, we recommit ourselves to doing everything we can to support them and to encourage them and to ensure that those heroes are properly supported with weapons that they can use to win this war and to stop the brutality, the illegal, the unprovoked attacks on a sovereign country that is our friend and ally and chose to stand with us. We now need to stand with them. Thank you.
Couldn't say it better myself, Senator. Both senators. Madam Ambassador, I see that you're still with us, so very grateful and thankful for your participation. Would you like any closing remarks? Say anything for a closing remark?
Just to say that, we gave up on nuclear weapons in 1994, but we have some super powers and some special weapons that are helping us today, from our brave president, who has been our superpower, not only being brave and leading the country, but also communicating with people around the world, to our friends. And we have two superpower friends here representing many friends like this we have in the United States, standing with us as long as it will take us to win. So it's going to be more difficult before it gets easy. We're gonna lose a lot of people before we will get Russians out from our country. But there is no other choice for us. The only choice we have is to fight. And we will fight and we will win. Thank you.
Madam Ambassador, I, again, couldn't have said it better myself. Very poignant ending to this particular webinar. I'd like to thank our two great friends of Ukraine, Senators Blumenthal, Senator Portman, Madam Ambassador, for such a truly enlightening discussion. You've given us, I would say, much food for thought, and frankly speaking, a lot of homework to do. But before we wrap up this very informative and important webinar, I'd also like to make an announcement about a special initiative of the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America. While we're grateful to have our friends in Congress at the wheel, such as Senator Blumenthal, introducing legislation and enhancing support for Ukraine, the Ukrainian community is also very fortunate to have many friends of Congress who have retired, but truly have never given up their passion to help Ukraine. Thus, the UCCA has formed the Congressional Ukraine Advisory Group of former elected officials, elected members of Congress, members of the Senate, members of the House of Representatives, who, along with the UCCA and our community networks, will assist in our advocacy of Ukraine-related matters on Capitol Hill. The group will be co-chaired by Senator Rob Portman. We're very truly thankful and with much gratitude to Senator Portman and Representative David Bonnier from Michigan, as well as several other members that are waiting in the wings to join after this official announcement this evening. We are delighted, more than grateful, to the former elected officials for their sincere cooperation with the UCCA and advancing the prospectus and the prospects for a victory in Ukraine and in the eventual rebuilding process as well. You'll hear more about the group and its work in the next days, weeks, and months to come. But lastly, I'd also like to thank the audience members for your participation this evening. I think that this was truly, as I'd mentioned before, a very thought-provoking discussion, very insightful discussion, and a big thank you to my colleagues behind the screens for all your assistance this evening. Thank you. With that, have a wonderful rest of the evening and see you in 2 weeks at the Ukrainian Days Advocacy event in Washington, D.C. on March 8th and on March 9th. Thank you all. Good evening. Добраніч. Слава Україні.
Героям слава.
Героям слава.
Thank you, everyone.